The story of Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, known globally as CECOT, does not begin with concrete or steel. It begins with fear. A long, sustained, generational fear that shaped daily life in El Salvador for decades, turning ordinary neighborhoods into contested territory and ordinary citizens into silent hostages of an invisible war. For much of the late 20th and early 21st century, El Salvador existed under the shadow of criminal organizations that operated with the efficiency of parallel governments. The country's civil war ended in 1992, but peace did not arrive with it. Instead, a new structure of violence took hold. Gangs formed from displaced identities, deportation cycles, and fractured institutions. Over time, they hardened into transnational criminal systems with rigid hierarchies, internal courts, recruitment pipelines, and enforcement arms capable of paralyzing entire cities. By the 2010s, the threat was no longer abstract. Entire districts were carved into invisible borders. Crossing a street could mean death. Bus drivers were extorted or murdered. Shop owners paid rent not to the state, but to men with guns and tattoos who controlled the block. Schools adjusted schedules around gang presence. Police patrols moved cautiously, sometimes escorted, sometimes ambushed. Homicide rates climbed until El Salvador earned a grim distinction as one of the most violent countries on earth. This violence was not random. It was systematic. Organized. Enforced through terror as a governance tool. Gangs regulated movement, punished disobedience, and executed those who defied them. Their power rested not only on weapons, but on psychological dominance. Silence became survival. Cooperation with authorities was viewed as a death sentence. Witnesses vanished. Families fled. Others stayed, trapped by poverty, geography, or fear. For years, the Salvadoran state responded with conventional measures, arrests, short-term crackdowns, temporary surges of police and military patrols. Prisons filled quickly, but control inside them slipped away. Overcrowded facilities became command centers where incarcerated gang leaders issued orders to the outside world using contraband phones and corrupt intermediaries. Detention did not dismantle the system, it reorganized it. The prison system itself became a liability. Existing facilities were not designed to isolate large numbers of highly organized, ideologically committed, and violence-trained inmates. They were porous, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Guards were outnumbered. Intelligence leaked. Riots erupted. Murders occurred behind bars. The line between inside and outside blurred until incarceration lost its deterrent effect entirely. Public trust eroded alongside public safety. Each massacre, each mass grave, each spike in homicide statistics reinforced a sense that the state was losing control. Citizens demanded protection, not reform. Order, not negotiation. The political atmosphere hardened, and with it, the tolerance for extraordinary measures grew. When a dramatic surge in killings occurred in early 2022, attributed to coordinated gang retaliation, it became the final catalyst. The government declared a state of exception, suspending certain constitutional protections and expanding arrest powers. Thousands were detained in weeks. Then tens of thousands. The scale was unprecedented, and it immediately raised a new problem: where to put them. CECOT was the answer to that problem. Not a prison in the traditional sense, but a containment facility designed to remove the most dangerous elements from society permanently and efficiently. Its purpose was not rehabilitation. It was neutralization. The state framed it as a necessary instrument of survival, a response proportional to an existential threat. Built rapidly and at immense scale, CECOT was conceived as a symbol as much as a structure. It was meant to signal a decisive break from decades of perceived weakness. Where previous prisons failed to isolate gang leadership, this one would sever all operational capacity. Where corruption once penetrated walls, this place would be sealed. Where inmates once exercised influence, here they would have none. The official narrative emphasized safety and restoration. Streets reclaimed. Extortion halted. Schools reopened. Bus routes resumed. For many citizens, the immediate results felt tangible. Homicide rates dropped sharply. Visible gang presence receded. Fear loosened its grip, at least on the surface. But the creation of CECOT also marked a profound shift in the philosophy of punishment. This was not a facility designed to correct behavior or reintegrate individuals into society. It was designed to contain bodies indefinitely, under conditions of extreme restriction, with minimal movement, minimal communication, and minimal visibility. The government described the inmates sent there as irredeemable threats, individuals whose continued existence within society represented an unacceptable risk. The language was absolute. These were not offenders to be managed, but enemies to be removed from circulation. International observers watched closely. Human rights organizations raised alarms about due process, mass detention, and the psychological impact of such confinement. Supporters countered that conventional frameworks had failed, and that extraordinary violence demanded extraordinary solutions. The debate was not merely legal or ethical, it was existential. CECOT exists because the state concluded that it could no longer coexist with certain forms of organized violence. It exists because previous prisons became extensions of criminal networks rather than barriers against them. It exists because fear, sustained over decades, eventually reshaped public tolerance for state power. This institution is not an anomaly. It is the physical manifestation of a political decision, that security would take precedence over rehabilitation, and containment over correction. Its walls are not just barriers against escape, they are boundaries drawn between two visions of governance, one rooted in procedural restraint, and one in absolute control. Understanding why this place exists requires understanding the scale of the threat it was built to contain, and the depth of the failure it was meant to correct. CECOT was not born from a single crime or a single riot. It was forged from years of accumulated violence, institutional collapse, and a society pushed to the edge of endurance. This is the context in which its gates opened. Not quietly. Not cautiously. But with the full weight of the state behind them. If Chapter 1 explains why this place was built, then this chapter explains how it works. Not philosophically. Not politically. But mechanically. Because CECOT was not designed as a conventional prison. It was engineered as a system, a closed loop of surveillance, restriction, and behavioral suppression where architecture itself becomes an instrument of control. From above, the facility looks less like a correctional institution and more like a fortified industrial zone. The layout is deliberate, geometric, and optimized for visibility. Straight lines dominate the landscape. Rectangular housing blocks sit within layers of perimeter defense. Movement corridors run in predictable paths, leaving no blind corners and no areas where observation can be interrupted. The first barrier is distance. The facility sits isolated from dense civilian population centers. Not hidden, but separated. This reduces external interference, limits civilian proximity, and ensures that any approach to the prison is visible long before reaching the outer perimeter. Even before walls are encountered, the geography itself functions as a buffer zone. The outer perimeter wall is not simply tall, it is psychologically imposing. Thick reinforced concrete rises vertically with minimal external texture, offering no natural climbing grip. Atop this barrier sits dense razor wire configured not in a simple loop, but layered and angled outward, designed to slow, trap, and injure. Above that, mesh fencing prevents thrown tools or materials from reaching the wire. Guard towers punctuate the perimeter at calculated intervals. Their placement allows overlapping lines of sight, eliminating blind zones. Each tower is positioned not only to watch the exterior, but also sections of the interior yard. Guards stationed here are not just observers, they are early warning systems, trained to identify abnormal movement patterns rather than react to active escape attempts. Entry into the facility passes through multiple hardened checkpoints. Vehicle gates are reinforced steel with internal locking bars. Secondary gates create controlled choke points, allowing only one vehicle or group to pass at a time. This is intentional. It prevents forced entry scenarios and ensures every movement is documented, searched, and authorized. Inside, the design philosophy shifts from perimeter defense to behavioral containment. Housing units are constructed as massive concrete blocks divided into large dormitory-style containment halls. Unlike older prison models where smaller cells create individualized control, here the scale is different. Large groups are housed together, but under total surveillance and movement restriction. The goal is not privacy. It is constant visibility. Each housing hall is structured to eliminate concealment. Lighting is harsh, constant, and evenly distributed. Shadows are minimized. Fixtures are tamper-resistant. Even ceiling structures are simplified to remove anchor points for contraband or self-harm tools. Airflow systems are sealed behind reinforced grates. Beds are fixed metal frames bolted directly to the floor. There is no rearrangement. No personalization. No spatial ownership. This matters psychologically. When inmates cannot modify their environment, they cannot establish territory or status hierarchies through space control. Movement is choreographed. Inmates do not move freely between areas. Transfers occur in tightly controlled groups, often under escort, often under time restriction. Doors open and close in sequence, preventing crossflow between units. This prevents organized gatherings, reduces communication opportunities, and limits the spread of planning or coordination. Corridors are long, narrow, and camera-saturated. Surveillance is layered. Ceiling-mounted cameras overlap with wall-mounted units. Motion sensors supplement visual monitoring. Recording is continuous. There is no expectation of privacy, at any time, in any space outside basic sanitation zones. Isolation is built into the design. Solitary confinement sections are structurally separate from general housing. Cells are narrow concrete compartments with steel doors and limited openings. Sound insulation is partial, enough to reduce communication, but not enough to eliminate ambient facility noise. Silence is never complete. Neither is comfort. Recreation space, traditionally a pressure release component in prisons, is deliberately minimal. Yards are enclosed by walls and steel mesh overhead, preventing aerial contraband drops or drone contact. There are no open fields, no exercise equipment clusters encouraging gathering, and no blind corners. Presence is monitored continuously from elevated observation points. Even administrative areas follow the same philosophy. Control rooms are elevated and centrally located. From these spaces, officers monitor camera feeds covering nearly every square meter of operational space. Digital systems track door status, movement timing, and access logs. The prison is also designed for rapid lockdown capability. In emergency scenarios, entire sections can be sealed electronically and mechanically. Doors default to locked states. Internal barriers segment the prison into containment zones, preventing unrest from spreading beyond a single block. Escape, in this environment, is not simply difficult. It is structurally improbable. To escape, an inmate would need to bypass internal surveillance, breach multiple reinforced doors, avoid controlled corridors, cross monitored yards, scale layered perimeter defenses, and evade armed tower surveillance, all while triggering multiple alarm systems. But physical escape is only one dimension of control. The deeper layer is psychological. Architecture here removes unpredictability. Every day looks identical. Every corridor feels identical. Every wall is identical. This erodes temporal awareness and spatial individuality. Over time, inmates lose environmental reference points. Disorientation becomes normal. Routine becomes absolute. Noise control is also strategic. The absence of chaotic environmental noise means that any unusual sound, running footsteps, metal contact, shouting, becomes immediately noticeable. Silence becomes another surveillance tool. Lighting cycles are regulated. Not harsh enough to be classified as torture, but constant enough to prevent deep circadian rhythm stabilization. Sleep exists, but never fully detached from institutional presence. CECOT's architecture communicates a single message: control is permanent, total, and impersonal. Not the control of individual guards. Not the control of temporary authority. But the control of the structure itself. In many traditional prisons, control depends on staffing ratios, discipline systems, or inmate hierarchy management. Here, the building itself enforces compliance. Guards operate the system, but the system reduces the need for negotiation, intimidation, or reactive force. This is containment through predictability. Suppression through environmental dominance. Authority embedded not just in policy, but in concrete, steel, and wiring. The result is an institution where resistance has no visible target. There is no single weak door. No poorly monitored corridor. No neglected yard. Control is everywhere, and therefore nowhere specific. This is the architecture of control, not designed to punish in moments, but to dominate continuously. The population inside CECOT is not defined by ordinary criminal categorization. This is not a facility built for mixed sentencing populations, first-time offenders, or inmates cycling through rehabilitation programs. The individuals sent here represent a specific category of threat, one defined less by individual crimes and more by their role within organized systems of violence. To understand who is sent to this facility, it is necessary to understand the difference between a conventional prisoner and a networked criminal operator. In most prison systems, inmates arrive as individuals. Their crimes, while serious, are usually self-contained. Even when organized crime is involved, incarceration typically fragments those networks over time. CECOT was built for inmates who do not fragment. The majority of inmates transferred into this facility are associated with deeply structured criminal organizations, primarily gangs with hierarchical command structures, internal discipline codes, recruitment pipelines, and transnational influence. These organizations function less like street-level criminal groups and more like shadow institutions, capable of sustaining operations even when leadership is incarcerated. Many of these individuals held operational authority outside prison walls. Some directed extortion networks covering entire districts. Others coordinated violent enforcement squads responsible for maintaining territorial control. Some functioned as logistical coordinators, managing weapons supply, communications, and financial movement through illicit channels. The state classifies these inmates not simply as violent offenders, but as high-influence criminal actors, individuals whose presence in standard prisons historically allowed them to continue commanding operations through contraband communication systems or intermediary networks. Security classification inside CECOT reflects this philosophy. Traditional prison categories such as medium or maximum security are replaced by a more absolute classification logic. Placement is based on perceived long-term threat capacity, organizational affiliation, and operational history rather than just sentencing length. Another defining characteristic of the population is institutional resilience. Many inmates sent here have spent years cycling through detention systems before. They are familiar with prison environments. They understand guard routines. They understand institutional vulnerabilities. In traditional facilities, this knowledge often allows them to rebuild internal hierarchies quickly. CECOT is specifically designed to neutralize that advantage. Psychologically, the population inside the facility tends to share certain patterns. Many display high tolerance for violence exposure. Many demonstrate strong loyalty to group identity structures. Some exhibit adaptive behavioral control, the ability to remain outwardly compliant while internally maintaining organizational allegiance. Others show traits consistent with long-term exposure to violent social structures. Emotional detachment is common. Hypervigilance is common. Authority resistance is common, though often expressed through passive non-cooperation rather than overt confrontation. Importantly, not every inmate fits a single psychological profile. Some entered gang structures in adolescence, shaped by survival rather than ideology. Others rose into leadership through strategic intelligence and organizational skill rather than physical violence. The population is unified less by personality and more by function within criminal systems. Age distribution is also broader than public perception suggests. While many inmates are young to middle-aged adults, there is also an older cohort, individuals who have spent decades embedded in criminal networks. These inmates often carry institutional memory of how gang structures evolved, how enforcement strategies changed, and how state responses adapted over time. From a control perspective, older inmates can be as strategically dangerous as younger, more physically aggressive ones. Their influence tends to be ideological or organizational rather than physical. Another key population segment includes individuals previously responsible for prison-based coordination. Before facilities like CECOT existed, gang leaders often continued directing external operations while incarcerated. In some cases, prisons effectively became regional command centers. CECOT exists specifically to prevent that outcome. Communication restrictions are therefore central to inmate selection. Individuals with proven histories of using incarceration as an operational advantage are prioritized for transfer. The goal is not simply punishment. It is operational severance, the permanent disruption of command continuity between incarcerated leaders and active external members. Gender demographics are overwhelmingly male, reflecting the composition of high-ranking gang structures in the region. However, the selection logic remains threat-based rather than demographic-based. The facility is built around containment capability, not population diversity. Health profiles inside the prison are also complex. Many inmates arrive with untreated medical conditions, long-term trauma exposure, or substance dependency histories. However, medical vulnerability does not influence placement decisions when weighed against perceived public safety risk. What separates this population from ordinary prisoners is not simply violence, but persistence. These are individuals who historically continued influencing crime patterns even while incarcerated. The facility is designed under the assumption that conventional containment methods are insufficient for this group. There is also an important distinction between symbolic power and operational power. Some inmates once held symbolic authority, reputation-based influence capable of triggering violence through fear alone. Others held logistical authority, the ability to move money, weapons, and personnel efficiently. CECOT is designed to neutralize both. Within the facility, individuality is intentionally minimized. Group identity is stripped through uniform clothing, shaved hair policies, and synchronized routines. This is not only for visual control. It is for psychological equalization. When status markers disappear, internal hierarchy formation becomes more difficult. However, institutional research worldwide suggests hierarchy never fully disappears. It adapts. Even in highly controlled environments, social influence can manifest through subtle signals, shared history, or coded communication. This is one of the constant challenges of managing a population built around organized identity. Another defining factor is sentencing trajectory. Many inmates sent to CECOT face extremely long-term incarceration. Some effectively face permanent removal from society. This creates a different psychological environment compared to facilities where release remains a realistic horizon. Hope, in conventional correctional theory, is often a behavioral stabilizer. When hope disappears, behavior can shift unpredictably. Some inmates become compliant. Others become psychologically withdrawn. Some may become internally radicalized further, reinforcing ideological loyalty rather than abandoning it. From the state's perspective, this population represents a category of risk that cannot be mitigated through gradual rehabilitation timelines. The strategy instead focuses on physical and operational containment indefinitely. The result is a prison population defined not by individual stories, but by structural threat classification. These are individuals assessed as capable of destabilizing entire regions if allowed communication, mobility, or organizational presence. CECOT is therefore not designed for transformation. It is designed for interruption. Permanent, controlled interruption of criminal continuity. Understanding who is sent here reveals the deeper philosophy of the institution itself. It is not built for people who committed crimes once. It is built for people the state believes will never stop. CECOT is not only a prison. It is a message. Not spoken through speeches or policy documents, but through permanence. Through walls that do not suggest temporary custody, but final separation. Through routines designed not to reform, but to neutralize. To understand the consequences of this institution, it is necessary to look beyond daily operations and examine what happens over years, to inmates, to society, and to the idea of state authority itself. For inmates housed inside CECOT, time does not function in the traditional correctional sense. In many prison systems, time is structured around progression. Good behavior can mean transfers. Transfers can mean privileges. Privileges can mean gradual reintegration. Here, progression is largely absent. Time is measured not in steps forward, but in repetition. Identical mornings. Identical meals. Identical counts. Identical nights. Long-term exposure to this level of environmental control produces predictable patterns. Some inmates become deeply compliant. Not necessarily rehabilitated, but behaviorally stable. When every action is predetermined, resistance becomes physically exhausting. Over years, some inmates simply stop testing boundaries because the environment provides no reward for doing so. Others respond differently. Psychological withdrawal is common. In extreme containment systems globally, long-term inmates often develop flattened emotional expression. Conversation becomes minimal. Social interaction becomes functional rather than relational. Identity shifts from personal narrative to institutional role, inmate number, bunk position, scheduled movement slot. There are also cases where long-term containment produces internal radicalization rather than erasing it. When individuals lose physical access to organizational structures, ideological loyalty can intensify internally. This does not always translate into outward behavior, but it can preserve identity structures long after external operational influence disappears. Physical health outcomes are complex. Highly controlled environments reduce exposure to external violence, but sedentary confinement introduces long-term medical risks. Muscle atrophy, metabolic conditions, and chronic stress-related illness become part of the institutional medical landscape. Medical care exists, but always within security constraints. Every treatment interaction is monitored, scheduled, and restricted. Deaths inside ultra-restrictive prison systems worldwide typically fall into three broad categories: natural causes linked to long-term incarceration stress, untreated chronic disease progression, or self-harm in extreme isolation conditions. While specific cases are rarely publicized in operational detail, the statistical patterns follow known global correctional trends in high-security containment systems. Riots, which historically defined many prison systems, become structurally difficult in environments like CECOT. The architecture prevents mass congregation. Movement is segmented. Communication is restricted. However, this does not eliminate unrest entirely. Instead, unrest shifts form. Hunger strikes, coordinated silence, refusal of routine compliance, these become the new languages of resistance in highly controlled institutions. Hunger strikes, when they occur in ultra-secure environments globally, are less about immediate policy change and more about visibility. In facilities where inmates have almost no external communication pathways, controlling their own bodies becomes one of the few remaining tools of protest. These events are typically managed medically and administratively, but they highlight the tension between absolute control and human autonomy. From the perspective of prison staff, long-term work in environments like CECOT produces its own psychological environment. Guards operate in a space where unpredictability is reduced, but vigilance is constant. There is no relaxed shift. Every corridor is monitored. Every movement is logged. Every interaction is procedural. Over time, this creates emotional distancing as a professional survival strategy. Some officers report preferring highly controlled environments because they reduce physical danger. Others describe a different burden, working daily inside a system designed around permanent containment rather than correction. In many correctional cultures worldwide, officers are trained to maintain order while believing rehabilitation remains possible. In facilities like this, the mission is different. It is stability through permanence. On a national level, the existence of CECOT represents a dramatic shift in how the state defines public safety. Supporters argue it restored order where conventional policing and incarceration failed. Streets once controlled by gangs became accessible again. Extortion networks weakened. Homicide rates dropped significantly. For many citizens, the results felt immediate and undeniable. Critics, particularly international human rights observers, focus on due process concerns, mass detention risks, and the long-term ethical implications of indefinite containment. Questions are raised about wrongful detention risk in mass arrest operations, about legal transparency, and about the psychological consequences of extreme isolation systems. The global debate around facilities like CECOT is not new. It echoes discussions around supermax prisons in other countries, where security effectiveness is weighed against long-term human rights standards. The core question remains consistent: at what point does security policy shift from protection to permanent removal? CECOT also represents something deeper than a prison. It represents a state decision about what to do when crime is no longer perceived as individual behavior, but as organized warfare against civil society. In that framing, correction becomes secondary to containment. Rehabilitation becomes secondary to disruption. For citizens living outside its walls, the prison functions as reassurance and warning simultaneously. Reassurance that organized violence can be suppressed. Warning that state authority can expand dramatically when public safety collapses. Historically, societies often create institutions like this during periods of existential fear. The long-term legacy of such institutions usually depends on what happens after the immediate threat subsides. Some become permanent fixtures of national security policy. Others are later viewed as extreme measures tied to a specific historical moment. The ultimate consequence of CECOT may not be measured only in crime statistics, but in how it reshapes the relationship between citizen, criminal, and state power. It forces a question every society eventually faces: how far should a government go to eliminate threats that conventional systems cannot contain? CECOT stands as one possible answer. Not temporary. Not flexible. But absolute. Declaration that, in this moment of history, containment was chosen over compromise.